for Season 2 of Godless Reads. Godless Reads is the Chilling Tales for Dark Night show where godless authors read their own stories, no matter how filthy, disgusting, weird, and wild they are. I'm your host, Stepek, owner of Godless.com and the Godless app, and a horror author myself. I'm also a used car salesman and 90s loser. This season we're focusing on body horror and cryptids and all sorts of other weird stuff that we didn't really hit on in the first season. On this Godless Reads Season 2 premiere, we've got something really special for you. Our friend Rob Ulitski from England reads his story, Crystalline, from his awesome body horror collection called Flesh Out, which you can buy on Godless and Amazon. Rob Ulitski, or Bobby Boy as I call him, is somebody to look out for. This story is gonna blow your fucking mind. Trust me on this. It's fucking awesome. We're currently celebrating the 2-year anniversary of Godless. We're doing all sorts of crazy giveaways, and there's new books coming out every single freaking day. The wildest shit you've ever read or heard. So be sure and check out Godless.com and the Godless app today, brother. A special thanks goes out to Craig and Natalie from Chilling Tales from Dark Nights for knowing what time it is and bringing back Godless Reads for all you crazy freaks who want to watch it. Kick back, grab your drug of choice, and let Rob Ulitski take you inside his body horror madness with Crystalline.
Helena couldn't go on living as she was. Her small 2-bedroom flat, illuminated by dim floor lamps and several glitchy LED fixtures in her ceiling, was falling apart at the seams. A whirring static from the television fought against the hiss of a white noise machine, creating a cacophony of frustrating sound that she had long become acquainted with. The sound helped settle James's migraines, but had the opposite effect on Helena. She very much looked forward to the day that she could live in peace again, and mull over the minutiae of life in a calm silence. James was their younger brother, and currently inhabited the larger of the 2 bedrooms. His space consisted of a bed, some medical equipment and a few books, but no kind of decoration or flair. The floors were covered in mismatched, thick rugs in the event of a fall, and any sharp items had already been removed in anticipation of potential anger outbursts. The 24-year-old man had suffered a multitude of issues since downing a toxic cocktail of drugs at a house party a couple of years prior, and his barely older sister had taken on the role of his carer. The traditional care system had long become null and void, thanks to continuous spending cuts and the abolishment of the National Health Service, and the pair barely made ends meet. Helena had a part-time side hustle as a cam girl, and a couple of clients gave her enough resources to cover the house and bills, with a little to spare on a skimpy new dress every month or so. But even the sugar daddies were penny pinching in these times, but she was thankful for what she could get. James was settled in bed, having just eaten a slurry of chicken dinner blitzed into a gloopy, unappetising soup. His eyes were heavy, flickering open and shut, so after wiping away the sweat from his forehead, Helena switched off the overhead light and crept into the hallway. The rhythmic beep of the medical machines faded away softly as she shut the door and made her way into the kitchen. The claustrophobic space was marred by peeling wallpaper, swollen patches of black damp and crumbling brickwork, but she had tried her best to hide the rot with an ill-assorted combination of second-hand canvas prints and cheap pastel paint. On the kitchen table, a flurry of letters were streamed from one side to the other. She collected them into a rough pile and slid them to the back end of the surface, next to the window. An old laptop sat idle right next to them, with a cheap webcam clipped to the screen. Her technical setup was as dated as the structure around her, but it did its job. She double-clicked the trackpad, patiently waiting for it to spark to life, but it didn't. After a few more clicks and a tap of the keyboard, it slowly crawled into a standby position, and then onto our home screen. A notification popped up in the toolbar, and a rudimentary app opened up in full screen. The camera started to transmit a live video, and Helena shook her head over her shoulders. She undid the first 2 buttons on her blouse, plumped her cleavage into prime position, and grew a shy smile on her face. Another video joined her on screen. The square box showed a video feed of Tommy, a 50-something-year-old Londoner with rough yet traditionally handsome features. He smiled, showing off a set of sparkly veneers. "Long time, love. How you keeping?" Helena chuckled. Well, I wasn't expecting you back so soon." Tommy grinned. "If memory serves, you went off with that girl, Madison. I take it didn't last," Helena teased. "Nah, you know me, babe. I'm just too kinky. She went into the feet stuff or the bondage, so I had to get rid of her. Shame, but at least I've got you back now. I've learned some new tricks since we last spoke, Helena teased. Helena reached down and undid another button on her blouse. Tommy watched in anticipation, but she was going slow, taking her time. He was her only booking that night, so it was in her best interest to make it last. In an ideal world, she would have been at Tommy's house, performing in person for a much bigger sum. Unfortunately, the waiting list for external carers was gargantuan, and without one of those, she couldn't leave James's side. Helena was effectively on house arrest, so her only real social time was on these calls. Leaning back on her chair, Helena crumpled herself into a ball, showing off her dirty white socks and stroking the webcam with her toes. Her body was awkwardly positioned as to avoid the floor lamp behind her, which immersed her frame in a warm orange glow. It was one of her better lamps, so she didn't want to accidentally knock it over. "You like what you see, Tommy boy?" Helena undid the final button on her blouse and sensually slipped it off her shoulders, discarding it onto the floor. A low groan emitted from his mouth, and Helena continued to caress the small lens with her foot. Outside, the wind seemed to pick up, rattling the decrepit window frames against the crumbling exterior walls. Tommy was touching himself off screen. Helena could tell by his relaxed facial expression. This only made her want to perform better, so she started to groan softly in collaboration. The sound of cracking metal debris echoed outdoors, but Helena was too focused on her performance to notice. She was obsessed with how she looked on camera, how excited Tommy was to experience her in this intimate moment. Tommy's moaning became more regular, and that was her cue to take it up a notch. With a practiced twist, she undid the back of her bra and let the strap slip past the top of her shoulders. As the material slid down her pale arms, an ominous screech emerged from her garden. She broke character for a moment, staring towards her back door, listening to the sound get louder and closer. Before she could utter a word, the door frame exploded, and a wave of shattered glass sprayed across the kitchen. Helena dove from the chair, avoiding the rain of shards, and landed hard on the tiled floor. The laptop followed suit, clambering to the surface with a thud. A scent of rotten ammonia filled the air, and a sickly heat radiated from the unidentified black mass that had crashed into her kitchen. Helena covered her mouth with her hand, gasping to avoid the toxic smoke that engulfed the object. From the cracked laptop, she could hear Tommy's voice rhythmically calling her name, checking to see if she was okay. For some reason, her eyes started to weep salty tears, and her head felt dizzy and confused. She squeezed her eyes shut, slumped onto the floor, and fell unconscious. Helena woke to a smoke-filled kitchen, shattered tiles, and a slew of melted appliances. It was the crack of dawn, and the orange light from outside was masked by a dusty haze. The culprit was a gritty black rock, around the size of a large pumpkin. The mass had indented the corner of the kitchen floor, cracked several tiles, and splintered a cupboard on its journey. Her laptop had run out of juice, so Tommy's voice was no longer ringing through the tinny speakers. She shoved some debris to the side and climbed to her feet, brushing off the dust from the fall. With bruised hands, she redid the clip on her bra and grabbed her blouse from the floor. Just as she leaned in to study the rock, a brash alarm echoed from inside the house, snapping Helena into alert mode. She sped through the hallway and directly to James's room. Splayed over the bed and onto the floor, his limbs were awkwardly entangled from a fall. Shit, sorry. Helena grabbed underneath his armpits, and with an almighty heave, she lifted him back onto the bed, untangling his limbs. He had soiled his underwear. With a deep sigh, she grabbed a fresh pair from a small basket. The smell of feces battled with the pungent scent in the kitchen, and Helena made a mental note to run around with some air freshener at her earliest convenience. The broom kicked up plenty of dust as it weaved through the debris. Helena swept the broken fragments of her kitchen into a neat pile at the side of the room, while she held her mobile phone between her ear and her shoulder, on hold with the police. How can I help? Hi, I just explained to the other guy that something flew through my window late last night. We don't deal with animals. That would be the RSPCA, ma'am. What? No, not a bird, Helena explained. Please be more specific, ma'am. Helena was quickly losing her patience. A big rock smashed through my window and has destroyed my kitchen. My insurance won't cover it, and I just need to know what my next steps are. There was a pause at the end of the line. Well, it doesn't seem like a police matter, ma'am. Let me check and call you back. The call handler hung up the phone. Helena shook her head frustratedly and walked over to the mass. with the bottom of the broom and the splintered leg of one of her kitchen chairs. She rolled the rock over to the back door and threw it outside into the garden. Right on cue, there was a thunderous knock on her front door. "Fuck me," she muttered, sauntering down the hill into the front of the house. Her hand gripped the handle as she bent down to squint through the peephole. James was shouting too, expressing himself in the only way he knew how, but the sound was muffled enough to ignore for a moment. 2 men were standing outside of the house, dressed in official uniforms, with name tags blazoned on their jackets. "We're here to collect an outstanding charge for rent arrears," one of them shouted through the door, detecting her presence. Fucking bailiffs. "Now's not a good time," Helena called back, but they weren't having any of it. The less patient of the 2 men slammed his fist on the door again, cloaking his impatience in a rhythmic knock. "It never is, I'm afraid. Please open the door." "Look, I'm going to call you guys, I promise. I just really need to sort something out right now," Helena said. "We need to talk today, not tomorrow, not the next day. We will enter by force." Helena clenched her teeth together, fantasizing about a violent outburst, but ultimately keeping her anger reined in. "I'll consider a payment plan. I'll look at what I can offer. Come back next week." "I have to go," Helena shouted before walking away from the front door. On her journey back to the kitchen, a wet drip tumbled from the ceiling above. A large area of the plaster had become damp and grey, and the moisture was dripping from it in tiny beads. Helena shook her head and continued. Then she remembered James, who was shrieking a slew of nonsensical words. Helena felt flushed, exhausted in fact. Her skin emanated a strange heat, the type you experience in the beginning stages of sunburn, but she hadn't been outside the house in days. Her forehead felt particularly sore, but she didn't have time to sort it yet. Instead, she was tending to James, who was having a full-blown anxiety attack because a spider had landed on his sheets. With the edge of a newspaper, she flicked the tiny insect into a used Tupperware container and threw it out the window, knocking the plastic against the frame to confirm that it had indeed left the building. James was soaked through with sweat, but after a few reassuring words and a sweep of the room, he settled back into a nap. The door closed with a gentle creak, and Helena could finally exhale. A neon yellow final warning notice dangled from the letterbox, which meant she had bought herself some time. Helena's bedroom was painted a pale pastel pink, with sky blue curtains and carpet. Before James had moved in with her, it was the first room she had decorated in anticipation of selling her house and going travelling. She had been 24 years old at the time, and only a couple of months away from flying to Bali to work as a digital nomad. Then James had his accident. The fantasy of walking out of her front door with a laptop and a small travel bag whipped around her mind on a daily basis, but she distracted herself from the thought. She had to focus on the present moment to avoid spiralling out of control. In her cupboard, she had a rotating choice of outfits, mainly dresses or t-shirt and jean combos. In one drawer, she kept all of her most prized possessions, including jewellery from her late parents, and a few collectible items she thought would be worth something someday. Scanning over the items in the cupboard, Helena carefully calculated how much she thought each of the possessions was worth. Her gold jewellery would probably fetch the most, followed by a sovereign ring and silver necklace. The debt was piling up, and she knew that even a token payment could keep the bailiffs at bay long enough for her to try and sort James's disability payments out. Helena loved her brother. She really did. But she also despised him, and as toxic as that thought was, it was something she felt in the deepest depths of her bones. James hadn't experienced responsibility. He went from alcoholic teen to drug-fueled adult without as much as a weekend job, burning through a small inheritance, and it was always up to Helena to clean up his mess, quite literally now. She pulled out some of the jewellery and tossed it into a pile on her bed, ready to pack up and contact the bailiffs first thing. It was only midday, but Helena was ready for bed. She squeezed the packet of frozen peas against her forehead whilst tinkering with the laptop, attempting to reboot it. A deep crack segmented the screen into 2 distinctive diagonal quadrants, but she could just about make out the desktop page when it finally loaded. Beneath the frozen veg on her head, a curious crawling sensation flowed through her skin. It was enough to make her remove the package and squish the newly formed lump between her fingers, feeling for any trapped debris or pus. Helena sat down the laptop and ambled into the bathroom. Her face was red, alright. Just beneath her hairline, a small bump had formed, topped with a pus-coloured head that was just begging to be popped. It didn't have the usual texture of a zit though. The contours of the lump were ever so slightly jagged, as if a minuscule piece of brick was stuck right underneath. Not able to resist, she slipped her fingers to opposing sides of the bump and squeezed with gentle force. There was an initial resistance, but it didn't last long. Within seconds, the spot erupted, smearing a snotty globule across the mirror, coloured deep yellow with streaks of bright red blood. There was a slight clatter in the sink below as the pus ejaculated over the porcelain. Helena slammed her hand into the bowl to catch whatever had fallen before it escaped into the drain. After sifting around for a short while, she was taken aback to see a tiny diamond, traced with blood and pus. She held it up to her head inquisitively, comparing the size of the rock to the bleeding crater in her face. It fit the fleshy crevice perfectly. Helena was back on the laptop, catching up with Tommy. She showed him the rock, rolling it between her fingers. "And you're saying to me that came out your face?" Helena smirked in disbelief. "Yeah, I mean it came right out of this hole." She leaned towards the camera to show the crater on her forehead, which had already started to crust over in a curiously short space of time. Tommy recoiled. "Look, darling, I love seeing your hole, but this ain't the kind I mean, if you know what I mean." They both giggled for a moment. "I'm sorry about last night, by the way. Something smashed through my window." "Babe, I was worried you just disappeared." I held on for a couple of minutes but didn't want to get charged too much. I'd rather save that for the action shots. He winked and Helena grinned. "I bet you do. So, do you think it's real?" Helena remarked, drawing attention back to the rock. "I mean, in the pawn shop we get wedding rings and sovereigns. It's hard to tell," Tommy answered. "But send it over and I'll have a look. If it's worth anything, I'll split it with you 80-20, he continued. 90-10, Helena teased. "Final offer." Tommy grinned and nodded. "Alright, but no charge for this little chat then. And next time I get full tits within 2 minutes." "Deal," Helena chirped. And with that, she repositioned the camera, slipped her legs above the table, and prepared to rub her dirty, 2-day ripe socks all over the lens again. Tommy grinned, already starting to moan under his breath. There was vomit everywhere. James hung out of the bed, thrashing violently, completely overwhelming Helena's slender frame. She was doing her best to keep him stable, whilst also holding a phone between her ear and shoulder. "It's getting worse. I told Dr. Lane 2 weeks ago I needed some support," she barked, flustered. "And what do you mean no one's available? I pay through the roof for insurance and, well, I've only missed one payment and I'm paying that next week." The phone slipped and smashed onto the floor, cracking the screen. Helena cursed, trying to wrestle with James as he flopped about, all whilst crouching down to retrieve the device. She squatted as low as she could go, but it was no use. After a few moments, she pushed him onto the bed forcefully, just in time to hear the line go dead. "Fuck!" she screamed, taking a moment to calm down. James had returned to an almost catatonic state, his eyes locked onto the ceiling above. Helena leaned over to grab a Tupperware of ready-made soup, a blitzed chicken stock puree, James's favourite. Well, as far as she knew, he didn't really react or give any social cues at all nowadays, but he didn't spit it out, so she considered that as a sign of his acceptance. As she started to pour some into his bowl, his eyes trained on her instead, and the most violent roar exploded from his mouth. His face was red, and he seemed to be in the midst of some kind of manic episode. With a clenched fist, he thumped Helena around the jaw, thrashing up and down again, vomiting over his bare chest and stained duvet. Helena lay on the floor, bleeding from her mouth. Tears began to stream from her eyes, and she didn't help James this time. Instead, she jumped out and exited the room, slamming the door shut. His wailing didn't dissipate for another 5 minutes, but Helena was long gone by then. In the garden, she stared up at the sky, the salty tears drying on her skin. Her phone began to vibrate in her pocket, and she quickly swiped the screen and held it up to her ear. "You better not be charging me for these calls." It was Tommy being his usual upbeat, cheeky self. "Well, that all depends on the information you have for me." "I have good news, I suppose." "And that is?" Helena pried. "The diamond. It's real, and worth a pretty penny too. You got any more where that came from?" Helena laughed in disbelief. "No kidding." She traced her finger over her forehead, and to her amazement, the wound had already closed right up. "That's great news, actually. I needed some good news." She sighed. "Having a hard time, love?" he asked inquisitively. The tears started to well up again, and Helena tried her best to keep things professional. Oh, you know how it is, Tommy. Living day to day like everyone else. He grunted in agreement. Keep your head up, hun. I'm here to chat if you need me. The warm water streamed over Helena's naked body, the caked blood washing away in a murky jet of crimson. She gently massaged her neck as she cleaned her hair and moved to her face. The shower was the one place in the house that Helena felt safe. Away from the panicked cries of her fading brother, away from the threatening calls of the bailiffs who hounded her for debt payments she had no way of paying. Away from inconsiderate doctors and the crippling expectation of a world that had gone to shit. All she needed was a moment of pause, to gather her thoughts and strength, before heading back out to the war zone reality. She continued to clean herself, wiping away frothy passion fruit scented bubbles, but her fingers stopped in their tracks, as she rubbed an unusual lump on her right temple. It was tender, and she couldn't apply much pressure. As she followed the contour of her face, she noticed a similar lump at the bottom of her cheek. She had presumed it was inflamed from the almighty punch in the face earlier, but it creaked ominously, as if something was broken, or rattling. She prodded at it, examining every slight movement, trying to work out exactly what was happening. Helena twisted the tap to stop the water and snatched her towel from across the screen. She wiped her feet on the rug and stepped towards the mirror. In the reflection, she noticed her face was slightly dried out and scaly, with cracks starting to appear in a very delicate formation. As she trained her gaze on the lump, she noticed that it had actually formed under the skin, on the inside of her cheek, right by her gums. She slid her finger into her agape mouth and traced the juicy lump before steadily applying more pressure. Her gum compressed slightly, further and further with each increase in pressure. The shape of whatever was broken inside the flesh was becoming clearer as she pushed, and with one last nudge, the skin broke, unleashing a torrent of blood and stinky yellow pus. Helena gagged, hanging her head over the sink, allowing the bodily juices to flow right out of her lips. A spiral of gunk formed in the bowl, but the foreign object was still lodged inside. Impatiently, she reached inside and tugged at her back teeth, steadily rocking back and forth with her fingernails to remove the object. The pain was immense, and her open mouth allowed her foul breath to escape right into her nose, increasing her urge to gag. Finally, with a small snap and a broken piece of tooth clattering out of her mouth, she had removed the object. She ran it under the cold tap and stood for a few moments, admiring its crystalline quality. It was otherworldly, ethereal, like nothing she had ever seen. Cleaning herself up, she was ready to get back to the real world, before she remembered the lump by her temple. She started to squeeze hard, begging for the clammy release. How much, Tommy? Helena had a hoodie slumped in her tender frame. The hood hid her face, and only the cracked, inflamed skin of her hands was exposed to the sunlight outside. She held the phone up to her head, shaking in pain. I reckon we can get a few grand. 5 easily. I have more. This week I've pulled out 15. That'll get us to about 30, right? Helena said. It had been 2 weeks since the initial event, and the crystals had continued to grow and erupt. Some were tiny, some were marble-sized. They began to spread like acne, tiny diamond-filled pustules clustered across her chin and cheeks. The inflamed skin had taken over her entire body, but only her face offered the bountiful stones. When can I see you again? I'd love to talk over cam. I have plenty of cash now, Tommy asked. Soon, Helena responded, before hanging up. She stumbled into the house, tripping over her own feet, trying to find her balance. Inside James's room, the dirty washing had started to pile up. She was feeding him tinned tuna and beans, but had lost the strength to create anything from scratch. James was calm but unwashed, sweat and dirt caking his face and body, with food stains covering most of his bedclothes. Helena carefully slid the hood down over her head and picked up a yellow-tinged rag. She moistened it in a bowl of stale water and began to rub it over James's gaunt features. After wiping away the majority of the visible stains, she wrung out the cloth and used it on her own face. A strange mixture of bloody phlegm came off with each swipe. She was carefully patting the rag around a jagged rock which took up the majority of her left cheek. It had broken the skin with extreme pressure and protruded at least 4 inches from her cheekbone. The deep red gem had a crystalline structure, rough and ready, with a slightly reflective surface. Her head bowed slightly from the sheer weight of the rock, and the skin around the wound was crusty and infected. She intermittently tugged gently on the object, seeing if it would budge, but its structure wasn't limited to the visible piece. Like an iceberg, it was grown beneath her face, and the pressure gave her a headache like she had never imagined. Her phone started to vibrate, and she slowly put the rag down, before retrieving the device from her pocket. "Hello," she croaked. "Hello, Ms. Jacobs, this is Dr. Lane. Apologies for my late reply. The receptionist notified me that your premium has been paid, so I can finally talk to you." "You were waiting for money?" Helena inquired. "Well, you know that we aren't a charity, Miss Jacobs. We have to prioritise those who support our business. We've always been very patient with your payment plans. I must admit, when we saw the balance had been paid in full, we all gave a small hurrah." "My brother is dying. You should have called earlier." "Well, that is why I'm calling now, Miss Jacobs. There's an experimental treatment in France. Very promising, but also very expensive. I'm not sure of your financial position, but it seems to have turned around, so How much?" Helena barked. "We're looking at an estimate of 100,000 plus travel and fees." "Okay, give me a couple of weeks," she muttered. After hanging up, Helena continued to rub the rag across her face, breaking the skin and letting the pus trickle down her neck. "Can we come in and discuss the payment plan? There are a few notes we wanted to hash out." The pair of bailiffs were standing outside of Helena's front door, emanating a much calmer aura this time around. She had sorted a payment plan, a mix of cash and possessions, and they had come to collect the first instalment. Helena ignored their words, shuddering as their loud, cocky voices ran through her head. Instead, she swung open the front window, grabbed her jewellery and cash in clumps, and threw them out into the street. Watching them scatter and flail for paper notes and small items was a small pleasure, and just as quickly as she had opened the window, she slammed it shut to continue with her day. Later that night, Helena fumbled on the trackpad, her fingers trying to remember the placement of the keys. She had never been the most technologically minded, but at the same time had never expected to forget the layout of a keyboard. She was tired, of course. In the 3 weeks since the event, she had dealt with countless near misses with James. Her vision was severely impaired by the perpetually growing rock, and she had forgotten to check up on him for 2 days straight. By the time she woke up from an extended slumber, he was lying in a menagerie of shit and piss, and had projectile vomited all over his body. The stench was rotten, she was sure, but in all honesty, her senses had dulled to a near non-existent level. The only one that had survived this mutation was her sense of touch. She double-clicked the trackpad, and again. Finally, the laptop sparked to life. The webcam app was already loaded from last time, and Tommy quickly joined the call. "My God," he exclaimed, choking on the last word as if to snatch the sentence right back into his mouth. "I've made up my mind," Helena stuttered. The crystal was now taking up the majority of the middle of her face. It tingled with agony. The infected skin was red raw, shimmering with bloody gore. The muscle had deformed around the rock, like a tree growing around an object that had been left on it over a matter of years. Her neck veins were protruding out of her skin, struggling to balance the extreme weight of the object. Her left eye had been mostly gouged out and displaced over a painstaking couple of days, and her other one was permanently disfigured by the burning red glow of the prism. She could hardly make out the screen, but followed Tommy's tinny voice and attempted to keep her composure. "I can reach 90,000 comfortably, but I spoke to my partner and we'll get the 100. "But are you sure there's no other way, love?" Tommy begged. "No. We have to do it, and I trust you, but I have to be sure this goes to James." "Of course. Anything for you, love," Tommy responded. "Hey, Tommy," Helena croaked, her entire body shaking in excruciating pain. Without waiting for a response, she ripped open her blouse and showed him her bulging breasts. Tommy chuckled, and Helena tried her best to do so too. The warm water streamed over Helena's naked body, the caked blood on her face washing away in a murky jet of crimson. Her head was balanced on the tiled wall, her frame twisted awkwardly, the remnants of her beautiful face staring directly up at the shower head. The water poured onto her jagged features and washed over the rock before splattering onto the floor. When she was finished, she wrapped a towel around her body and stepped out of the room. With the same rag she'd been using for a week, Helena washed down James. She couldn't see him, but held his hand with her free hand. She intermittently checked his pulse to ensure he was still alive, and silently prayed that he would make it and live a better life than the nightmare he currently endured. The doctors had a new term for his illness, mora corporis syndrome, or quite literally, body on pause, and that was a phrase that summed up this whole experience. It was such a stupid mistake, one that plenty of young men had made. Mixing recreational drugs on a hazy night out, celebrating one of his best friend's birthdays. He had fallen into a coma later that night, and to this day, Helena couldn't shake her last words to him. One day, you'll have to take some responsibility and look after yourself. She hoped that this statement would become true, that he could indeed look after himself one day. When she was long gone, after the treatment, maybe he would regain at least a semblance of his normal life back. After finishing up stroking his body with the rag, she gently backed out of the room for the last time. Helena sat in her kitchen, struggling to breathe. Propped up on a stool in the middle of the room, her head raced with nightmarish thoughts. What if she died and Tommy didn't keep up his end of the bargain? What if he left with the diamond and the money and left James to die in his own filth? What if he was caught and imprisoned for murdering her? Would James be dragged into the care system, ripped away from the chance of the treatment? She tried to calm her mind, though her increasingly hazy thoughts suggested she didn't have much time left. The rock was growing backwards as well as forwards, and she was sure it was slowly encroaching onto her brainstem. With perfect timing, the front door squeaked open, and Tommy announced his arrival. "Helena, babe?" After a slight pause, she responded, and Tommy slowly entered the room. "I'm so sorry, love. God, I wish I could help. Are you sure we can't get you to the docks?" "No," Helena snapped. "This needs to be private, and I need you to stick to the plan. Please." Tommy nodded in agreement. "Do you have the paper?" Helena ordered. Tommy withdrew a contract from his backpack. Though it would hold no kind of real legal weight, it made Helena slightly happier to be signing an official agreement. It was the best she could ask for, given the circumstances. "I wrote you exactly as you asked," Tommy explained. He grabbed the pen and tucked it between Helena's fingers, presenting the page to her on the back of a phone book so she could sign. She scribbled her name on the dotted line, aided by Tommy's direction, and he slipped it right back into the bag. "Love, you're 100% sure? I've never done anything like this." "You're my only option, Tommy," she answered. "You're the only one I trust." Tommy smiled. From webcam wanks to this, who could have imagined? Helena returned the smile, her lips distorted by the imposing, jagged rock. Tommy slipped a syringe from his backpack onto the floor and took off the protective lid. "I managed to get my sister to sneak this out for me. I don't know if it'll work, but it's worth a try." He plunged the needle into her neck, and her face grimaced slightly. She immediately felt a wave of euphoria, a transcendent feeling of calm which washed over her and dampened the pain she had felt for the best part of a month. The burning tingling faded away, and she slumped back on the stool. Tommy helped lower her to the floor and rested her head on a pillow from the living room. The intermittent beeps from James's room slowly dissolved into the atmosphere, and Helena's mind was finally at rest. She could still feel, but none of it was real anymore. Moments later, after checking her responses with small scratches to her neck, Tommy began to slice the outline of the rock with a razor-sharp scalpel. Blood and pus erupted from her chalky skin, and the rock began to slowly loosen. Helena felt the warm waves of blood on her face, but the pain was so distant, it was like she was out of her body, experiencing the entire thing from a different perspective. Tommy started to dig at the skin around the crystal, and applied pressure to jiggle it slowly out of position. Like having a tooth pulled under anaesthetic, Helena could feel the blunt tugging motion as her skull started to give up the rock, her brain being bashed around in its place. It wasn't loose enough yet. Tommy started to carve the muscle away, grimacing at the sight of his friend's mutilated face, frothing with blood as he ripped away chunks of wet flesh. Finally, the incision was deep enough, and the object was ready to be taken. I'm sorry, love. Rest easy. Helena was most of the way gone now, experiencing only vibrations and light, slowly slipping into the next world, finally at peace. Without further warning, Tommy tugged with all of his strength. With the sound of crushing bone and tearing meat, the rock splashed out of her skull, leaving a trail of gore and gunk. Tommy gagged, managing to hold his nerve, and slipped the basketball-sized stone into his backpack. He stared at Helena's mangled, crushed head, and knew it was an image that would never leave his mind. But he would keep his promise. He would sell this rock and pay for her brother's treatment. He'd even help him find somewhere to live in the interim. It's the least he could do. But he'd be taking an 80-20 split. Of course.
Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.